Welcome to Play It Forward, the podcast that explores why play is necessary for the well-rounded understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Our guests are experts in play from around the world, including authors, psychologists, play practitioners who share insight on the science, psychology, and practical applications of play. Whether you're an educator exploring innovative teaching methods or a parent seeking to enrich your child's development, we invite you to join us in discovering the transformative powers of play. Sarah is an author, a certified gentle parent master trainer, and a devoted mother, and a brilliant mind behind Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting. She is an advocate for the power of play, inspiring countless parents worldwide to embrace a more joyful, connective approach to parenting. Her expertise in gentle parenting combined with her deep understanding of play has made a significant impact on families everywhere. A big worthy welcome into the studio, Sarah R. Moore.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for our chat today.
In addition to Sarah R. Moore, we have Vanessa Ritson joining us to prompt some questions. When we were delving into your content around parenting and having that shared experience together, we thought it was a great opportunity to go backwards and forwards on our approach in parenting, maybe some challenges that we are trying to work through with our children. And we've got an expert available, so why not? I think it'll be very valuable to our listeners. So thanks, Vanessa, for joining us as well.
Pleasure.
Previously, we've always asked our guests where you played as a child. We're going to switch things up a little bit. I'm going to prompt you to start with a bit of a reflection. When did you realise the impact of play?
I love this question. One of my formative experiences as an adult, having an adult perspective of play, actually came while I was working for corporate America. I was working ridiculously long hours every single week. I was barely coming up for air. And although I loved my job, there was a part of me that frankly was kind of dying inside. I was not having any fun outside of the corporate stuff. So I was getting my intellectual bucket filled, but as far as just enjoying life, something was really missing. So I looked around and found that within a 5-minute drive of my office, there was an improvisational comedy school that offered night classes. And I thought, I need to do that. Never mind the fact that I'm not funny. Never mind the fact that I don't have a ton of stage experience. Somehow there's something about this version of play that is calling to my soul. So every day at the end of my long, exhausting business hours, I switched hats, so to speak, got myself up on stage, and ended up graduating from comedy school at night to sort of reintroduce myself to the power of emotional expression, of freedom, of joy, of impulsiveness, all of the things that happen in improv. And that's how, as an adult, I realized we never grow out of our fundamental need to play.
It's a great answer.
And it paints a beautiful illustration of what play is. There's that, you went through that moment of that willingness to move towards, which is essential. And then there is an element of fear. There is an opportunity to fail. But then that reward outweighs that fear and pushed you beyond to then activate this playful spirit, if you will, ongoing. And that's that embedded nature of play experiences that I think so many children in recent times are missing out on, unfortunately.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And my personal definition of play that I have changed since doing a lot of this work is really anything at all that brings you joy. And part of the reason I frame it that way is that it doesn't have an upper age limit. I want adults to be joyful. I want adults to feel like life is the kind of thing I want to be doing on a daily basis. And we can't do that without play in whatever form that takes. And it doesn't have to look like a board game or kicking a ball in the backyard. It can be anything at all that is joyful and that helps light up our lives.
Yeah, I love that. It's those definitions that vary so much just by doing this podcast, talking to children, educators, parents, just asking like, what is play to you? How do you explain it? And some of them end up in a realm of, well, if it's about the outcome, it's not play, which is very systematic approach and very adult language. I love Greg Muse as one that I've been playing with lately, and he says, if you want to understand play, don't try to explain it, just go and do it.
Yeah,
I love that.
that's great. So, Sarah, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write your book, Peaceful Discipline: Story Teaching Brain Science and Better Behavior.
Thank you for asking. There's the short version and the long version. I'm going to give you the version in the middle. And
Okay.
essentially, it was that when I became a parent, I had my daughter roughly 10 years ago, and at her 4-month checkup, I had a doctor look me in the eye and say, point blank, don't ever go to your child when she cries. She's manipulating you. Let me know when
Wow.
you get ready. And when I said I wanted to respond to her, she said, well, let me know when you're ready to get serious about parenting. Well, my jaw dropped. My nervous system actually went into freeze mode. I couldn't even respond to the man in the moment. But I went home and started doing all of the research that I could possibly do about how important it is to be responsive to children, not only when they're babies, but when they're older as well, and to foster a connection-based relationship. Only good things come from being responsive to our children. And the more research I started to do, the more it was put on my heart that I needed to help empower other parents and caregivers so that someday, when, whether it's a pediatrician or family member, friend, child care provider, whoever it might be, when somebody gives them some sort of advice that is contrary to what we know now about child development, that they would be empowered to push back on that respectfully and kindly, but to say, actually, I know something different that I'm choosing to do with my child, and to lean into that confidently rather than second guessing themselves. So, although that doctor said to me, and by the way, we switched doctors right after that appointment to a much better one, much more responsive one, but although he had said something that made me absolutely burn up on the inside in that moment about getting serious
Yeah.
about parenting, over time, I actually morphed that into gratitude towards him to say,
Yeah.
you know what, I am going to get serious about parenting. Thank you so much for making me so incredibly passionate in that moment that I would start doing this research, getting the certifications, learning about child development, studying the importance of play, trauma recovery, all of these things. And then basically almost a decade went by where this was still on my heart. I founded Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting, but there was still no book. And then essentially one day, about a year and a half ago, I literally woke up, and I can call it nothing more than a divine download. I basically
Yeah.
had the whole book, chapter by chapter, outlined, including the title of the book. I just had it all in my brain, and it was just my job to do the typing and get it out there to the world. And that was the impetus for Peaceful Discipline.
That is incredible.
Yeah, that's a great reminder for myself as well about just to be that messenger of
Yeah.
of the why that's so important. To go back to that doctor, and I think it's a good representation of culture and this like harden up or dust yourself off. Where do you think that's sparked that? Leave them alone. Like, what's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, historically, there have been psychologists, for example, a guy named B.F. Skinner, who was a child development quote unquote expert at the time. I mean, I shouldn't use the air quotes because he was considered a legitimate psychologist. However, one of his experiments, and this is hard to listen to, so I want to let people know that if this is too triggering for them, by all means, ground yourself, fast forward for a couple of minutes before, to get after what I'm going to say here. But B.F. Skinner had a couple of daughters with his wife, and with one of his daughters, he literally created a box to keep her in as an infant. And it had a hole where he could put his hand in for things like diaper changes and feeding and that sort of thing. But it was his own personal experiment to see what would happen with this child. And because she didn't die, he basically started to perpetuate this story about you really don't have to do anything other than feed them and change them, and they will survive. For stressed out, tired parents, it made it really easy for parents to say, look, this great researcher turned on his child, and if he can do it, that must be what I should do too. Back then, we didn't have things like MRI machines that we could put a child into to say, what's happening in the child's brain? Are there stress centers activating? We couldn't measure what was physiologically happening in the nervous system of the child at the time. We now know that all sorts of bad things happen when we leave children in situations like that and the modern day equivalent of it. But unfortunately, what's happened is that the myth has still perpetuated in society. That was our, grandparents' generation, give or take a generation, depending how old you are. But it's not that long ago that people thought, this makes it really convenient, and I'm going to do what makes it as easy as possible for me as the parent, even though we now have so much more data about the importance of responsiveness and nurturing relationships for children.
I just want to take a moment to apply your same gratitude lens to that story. That one person has had a huge impact on so many. So for our listeners, just a little reminder of the impact you can have. And that's why it's so important for all educators and parents to really prioritise play and the impact it has just through one person. And I think that's equally influenced this ongoing culture as well about the harden up, you're fine, dust it off. It's like kind of an extension of that. Do you think they're all related?
I do. I think everything that we do as parents is either drawing us more towards a connection-based relationship with our children or driving us away from it. So if we have chosen a path early on in our child's development where we are able to disconnect, to disassociate, and say, I'm not going to be responsive to that child, even when they're very young, what happens is that when our child gets older, we have effectively trained ourselves to still not be particularly responsive. And it's a tough thing, but I also want to say, if for somebody who's listening and says, oh no, I wasn't responsive to my child when they're younger, and I hear myself having trouble connecting now, there is hope. Change is always possible. There is forgiveness, there is grace, there is a path forward for you. So even if you have quote unquote trained yourself not to be as responsive as you would like, you can practice the skill, because we've got something wonderful in our head. It's our brain, and there's something called neuroplasticity, which is just a big fancy word that means we can learn new patterns. And when we learn new patterns, they can become habit, and we can heal the relationship and bring it forward based on connection rather than based on whatever painful past we might have in our parenting. Even if it's family of origin stuff we're carrying forward, cycle breaking is real and it's hard, so it just takes a lot of practice.
Yeah. I actually would love to jump straight into the trauma recovery side of, your work, and I'm really curious to see how play can help children work through trauma. It's been, I think, quite a passion of ours to see how that can be realized. And, you're talking about, well, we can change as parents, and we also have the ability to change those pathways in our mind. In your experience and with the work that you've done, how have you seen children transform from having traumatic experiences, no matter at what stage of their development, and how has, play or other elements of therapy or parenting been able to see children heal and come out the other side, essentially?
I love this question, and there are so many different roads I could go down with it, but
Yeah.
I think to summarize, play is essential in the healing of trauma for children. Play is, as Jean Piaget said, play is the language of childhood, and we have to know that children are going to get their stressors out in the form of play. Children don't have fully developed brains like we have as adults. Their language centers aren't fully developed. Their processing centers aren't fully developed. So a young child, let's say it's a 5-year-old, isn't going to sit you down and say, I've had this really traumatic experience and I want to process it with you and
Yeah.
go through all of the adult-like interactions that perhaps we would. And a child is going to say, I need to go play with my action figures or my stuffed animals or whatever. And here's the tricky thing for parents. Children often reenact their traumatic experiences in their play. And sometimes, I'll be blunt, it can be kind of macabre or morose or hard to watch. And yet, what they are doing is something called building a coherent narrative around their experiences. Coherent narrative is a fancy adult psychological term, but basically what it means is that we make sense of our stories. When children are allowed to play it through, it's them making sense of their stories and coming to some form of resolution with it. So if the adult sees something, let's pretend that the toy cow is attacking the toy bunny. It's tempting as an adult to say, "Oh, the poor bunny, stop that. Let's be gentle with the bunny," when really that child might have a legitimate need to do what they're doing in order to process something that has happened that was tricky or hard or traumatic for them. So our best bet is, especially along with, in the case of trauma, a trained play therapist, somebody who knows the language of children and how to translate it, how to help the child heal. Play really does have to be the language through which they can process, create that coherent narrative, express themselves emotionally in ways that they might not have the skills to do otherwise. But if we as the adult are too quick to put an end to a type of play that looks uncomfortable or inappropriate to us, essentially what we are doing inadvertently, even with the best of intentions, is saying to our child, you don't get to process that in your own authentic way. And we interrupt their healing process. So by all means, work with somebody who's trained, but play needs to be a part of it. The other thing I'll say briefly is, to the extent that stress has increased, play must increase all the more. Children only play when they feel emotionally safe enough to do so. They literally can't. The play part of their brain will shut down when they feel a lack of emotional safety. So, for a child who's been through stress, trauma, whatever it is, they need to increase their play because it's creating more and more safety at a bodily, subconscious, somatic level so that they can thrive and build resilience rather than just stuff down the stressors that they've experienced.
Wow, there's a lot in that. And yeah, I guess it's quite overwhelming as well to hear as a parent or as a caregiver or even an educator to think that we could be prohibiting the child to actually play out the therapy and the recovery that they need for their own healing. Just with what you've said about children need to feel safe to be able to play, that's heartbreaking as well, because you think about children who are in environments where there is ongoing stresses, there is ongoing trauma, but there is no end of safety for them either. There's no safe structure for them then to be able to play. And I know that we've had the great privilege of being able to work with some schools in our community where there are higher rates of violent homes, of abuse, of attendance being quite low at school and behaviour incidents being really high, where the schools have been able to implement certain play environments around loose parts in particular that have then allowed those children to begin to outwork some of those difficulties that they're having. And they've seen incredible results in those environments and for that community as well. Have you directly worked with families or communities in the same way where and perhaps it's more about, if we could just spend a moment talking a little bit more about the trauma work that you've done and the brain science behind it?
Sure. Yes, I have done some work in this area. And to be totally transparent, I am not a therapist. So I always do encourage people
Mm.
to seek out official therapists for this work. But by the same token,
Absolutely.
I have seen in action in classrooms where I've worked, in families that I've supported, the importance of play and being able to increase that to help increase the child's resilience, not only in processing that which has already happened, but also helping prepare them in how to move forward. And I talk a lot about that in Peaceful Discipline because play is an integral part of helping children learn. And I love that you brought up the loose parts play in particular, because oftentimes people think, well, all right, I know my child has to play more, so we're going to sit down and play a card game for 10 minutes tonight and I get to check it off my list.
Yeah.
Well, adult initiated play, where there are rules to follow and all of that, really doesn't give children the benefit of free play that they need. So it's the free play that's particularly important. And the other part of it that's important to pull out is that going back to the example I shared a couple of minutes ago with the toy cow and the toy bunny, there are still ways to be present in the play without interrupting that. And what I mean by that is number one, stay out of your children's way, let them play when they need to. That's really
Mm.
important. But we can also help increase our children's emotional intelligence and their empathy and things like that by debriefing with them. For example, if we've been in the room and the child knows that we've been present, so it doesn't feel like we've been eavesdropping or what have you, we can say to our child later on, without criticizing their play or judging it, we can say things like, I noticed how angry your cow seemed earlier today. What do you think was going on for them? And you can validate the child's emotional experience that they are expressing through the cow in this case, and be able to ask questions like, well, first of all, validate the feelings. It makes sense to me that the cow would be so angry. I noticed that the cow hit the bunny on the head. I wonder what else the cow could do when the cow feels like hitting that would still get that anger out, but that wouldn't be
Mm.
harmful to anybody. And you can help your child think of what else they might be able to do without going back and criticizing their play. Because as counterintuitive as it may sound sometimes, their play is, as it is, exactly perfect for them without the adult intervention.
Yeah, I like to remind educators and parents that, we live a life where it's about the outcome, and we've got a checklist and we've got a to-do list and we've got to do pickups and cleaning and dinner and all these things. But then for the child, it's about the victories in the process and not the outcome. So
Exactly.
collaborate in the
Mm.
process and not dominate it. Because when we are dominating, it ends up with that shutdown, the frustration, the anger, even some guilt and shame around it when we're like, oh, don't do that. And it's like, well, why? I'm working this out. It's an
Yeah.
experiment here. And it's a tangible representation as well. I think as adults, because we have that experience and the language to use, we give a lot of abstract ideas, like that
Yes.
aren't tangible. We know children learn through their senses and experience, but I just want to encourage the listeners, don't try to explain something because a child has no anchors to pull into that reasoning. As soon as it becomes tangible, oh, this is real. I can feel it, touch it, work it out. There's cause and effect within this engagement, not just, oh, stay in your bubble. The child's like, I can't see it. Like, where's his bubble? Where's my bubble? I can't see it, touch it, feel it, taste it. What are you talking about?
Yes.
And this creates more confusion. It's like, oh, why don't I get this thing? And then those levelers not feeling safe are increased. To touch on that safety point, what's your tips for parents, educators, to create that space where your child feels safe?
To play.
Ooh, brilliant question. Couple of things. We have to remember that our children's brains literally aren't wired like ours. So we are really good as adults at being productive, at getting stuff done. And we can really end up overriding our children's need for downtime, for playtime, for simply being. as they are. So, one of the things we can do is make sure that we are allowing enough open ended time for our children because it's going to mitigate their stress. And when their stress levels are lower, their behavior is going to be better. So, it's an investment in our child's well being by simply allowing more space, more simplicity. We also have to remember, as the adage goes, all behavior is communication. So if our child is acting out somehow, be it positively or negatively, they are telling us how they are feeling. So if they are acting in a way that appears to us to be suboptimal, that is our clue to say there's something for them that doesn't feel emotionally safe. So my job as the parent or the caregiver or the educator is to say, how can I support the child here rather than get judgmental or go back into my hyper productive adult mode of we just need to get out the door, we need to finish the thing, whatever it may be. But instead to know that it's the old iceberg model. We only see what's at the top, but there's so much beneath at any given moment. So if our child's behavior does start to go sideways, I'm going to quote somebody who was a friend of mine. She learned it from her mentor, but it's don't get mad, get curious.
It's
And
really
the
good.
more we can lean into getting curious about what our child is feeling and needing, which by the way is always 100% as valid as any adult feeling or need might ever be,
Yeah.
that curiosity helps grow compassion in our bodies. And the more compassion we feel, the more emotionally safe the child will be because they know that we're not out to get them, we're out to understand them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when a parent is at that capacity from the to-do list, from the busy days, they don't have margin. The child's having an emotional response because the emotional response is this environment, relationship combined, and then they might be angry, confused, or upset. But physically, we're just seeing what we would reduce down to, oh, they're having a tantrum, they're having a meltdown. Get up, don't be silly. We see it time and time again with children. However, if you walked into your home and your partner was upset and they were having an emotional response to their day, and we said, don't be silly, dust it off, get up, you're just having a meltdown, you'd be like, how dare you? Like, what are you saying to me? But for children, we're like, you're fine, dust it off.
Yeah.
And I think if we don't have margin, and it does come from a place, I think if we don't have margin as parents, as educators, we're going to react to that and say, oh, this is, if I have to deal with this and go on this journey, it's going to be hard for me. The quick win for me is stop it.
Yeah.
And I feel great. Meanwhile, the child's like, it's classic, like, I've never seen a child that's having a emotional response be like, oh, stop it, you're being silly. And they go, oh, yeah, okay, good point. No one does that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yes. And I love that you frame it this way. I do the same thing. I call it an emotional release. I don't even like using the words tantrums and meltdowns because they're so loaded and there's such an inappropriate description of what's really happening for the child in their nervous system. So I share your conviction about that message and I
Yeah.
thank you clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, it's really not honouring to the child to just say, oh, they're just having a meltdown. You're like, they're having a hard time here. Like, meet them where they're at. To just say it's a tantrum is really, really, really segregating in that
Belittling.
relationship and belittling. Yeah.
Just patronising.
Yeah.
We did some coaching last year, I suppose you could call it coaching, with Griffith University, and it's called the Parent-Child Interaction Program or Interaction Therapy, which I think you also have in the US. It's called PCIT. And one of the techniques that you learn through that therapy is to have 5 minutes of playtime every day. So just dedicating 5 minutes, 10 minutes if you can with the child. And it's really allowing them to lead some of the play. And there are some techniques that you learn to actually work through. But the thing that I suppose I took away from that is how important it is to bond with the child to create that feeling of safety. So I think as parents and mothers in particular, we know how important it is to bond with our children when they're infants and that bonding time, the connection for both the mother and the child is so necessary. But it's still important even when they're 6 or they're 8 or they're 10. And I suppose that playtime can change. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we also recently found a study that was done in Australia about the percentage of parents who actually enjoy playing with their children. And it was quite shocking. I know you're better with numbers than I am. Do you remember the statistics?
35%.
35% of parents prefer not to play with their children. So I know that you talk obviously a lot around that connection with the child. And I think just to that point particularly, what can parents do, or what would you advise parents who actually just don't want to play because maybe they don't know how
I don't
to?
know how. Yeah.
Yeah, what sort of advice would you give to parents? And I think it's also important as well for professionals working in the industry as well, who struggle with that connection.
Yeah, this is a beautiful question, and it's a hard topic. First of all, I want to give those parents grace and understanding because where that often comes from is a narrative that they received in their own childhood
Mm.
around play is a luxury only after you finish all of the responsible things. If
So
there's
true.
time left over, then you're allowed to play. But most days we were so busy we just didn't get to it. So most of us learned in our own family of origin that play wasn't really accessible because we had to do all of the other things first. So if that's where a listener is coming from, I want to say you make sense. Your body has essentially forgotten that play is supposed to be a birthright. And yet there are still ways for you to practice playing in ways that feel emotionally safe to you. So I'm going to throw out a couple of ideas that are going to sound unconventional, but I promise you they can be incredibly effective. Number one, if play feels emotionally unsafe to you with your child because it feels too chaotic or vulnerable or whatever it is for you, practice doing something. If I go back to my definition of play, which is anything that brings you joy, practice doing something that brings you joy for 5 minutes a day. It might be that you turn on a song that you used to like back before you had kids, and maybe you dance in the bathroom when you are all by yourself before you get in the shower in the morning. Whatever it is, you just find something that just ignites a little bit of a spark in your own nervous system, in your own body. Because what you need to do is start creating emotional safety for yourself, because without that, you can't co-create it with a child whose play might be more chaotic than your own. So the emotional safety part has to come from you. Find something, do it 5 minutes a day, even if it's not with your child. Then what I want you to do is once you've mastered that, visualize. Don't even go to play with the child yet. Just visualize. What would it be like to play with my child for 5 minutes? What's something that feels emotionally accessible to me? Do I feel safer kicking a ball around outside, playing with building blocks, doing something with dolls or Legos or whatever? What's something that I have enough control over that I feel like I might actually enjoy it? And then thirdly, take that thing into real life and do it, but do it with an eye on the clock for yourself. Commit to saying, I can do this for 5 minutes. And then what you do is you look at the clock, and I wouldn't even necessarily say that to the child because I don't want to create scarcity in the child's nervous system, but just in your own mind, look at the clock and say, I can do this for 5 minutes. Make it to that milestone, and then ask yourself, can I do this for 5 minutes more? If your answer is no, that's okay. Be gentle with yourself. This is brave, uncharted territory for you. But the goal is to incrementally increase your comfort level with it, knowing that on different days you're going to have more capacity than others. If you're tired, if you're hungry, it's not going to work. But on the nights when you've slept well, you're well nourished, whatever, you might have a little bit more capacity that day. And simply just take those baby steps into it, making sure that it is actually enjoyable for you too. Because if it's something that only your child likes and you hate it, guess what? It's not going to feel like play for you. So make it emotionally accessible, keep it concise, And then over time, your emotional safety will increase in your ability to play with your child.
That is an excellent, excellent response and so practical as well. Thank you for making that very accessible actually.
What's some examples that you would give of play scenarios, play frames, if you will, that lend itself to someone starting out on their journey?
Well, I personally think that music is a great connector, and oftentimes we have to find sort of the construct in which we want to use music. And the construct is really kind of the playscape that you're talking about. So maybe it's, I know that we're going to have dinner in a few minutes, and there's some music on which my child and I can agree. Perhaps it's not the music that I really like, but maybe it's something that my child likes that is tolerable enough and enjoyable enough for me that I can turn it on. But essentially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use music as a means to connect us in this moment. It'll be our transition time before we move into the next activity, knowing that we're going toward the dinner table or whatever it might be. And when the music's off, I'm done having to do it, so to speak, and I can move into the practical parts that I am so well conditioned to doing. But it's some way to add levity to an otherwise mundane task. I also really like tying it with any mundane task whatsoever. Getting out the door in the morning can be a chronic source of stress for parents and caregivers and their children. So I might tie some sort of playful approach to this chronically stressful situation to lighten the mood. So perhaps I go in with my false authoritarian hat on and say something like, well, I'm the parent, you have to do what I say. I made up a new rule. By the way, I am not at all an advocate of parents saying you have to do what I say because I'm the parent. I want to be very transparent about that. But I would say something like, I am the parent, you have to do what I say, and I have a new rule that when we walk from the living room to the garage to get the car, everyone is required to walk backwards the whole way. There's no forward stepping allowed anymore. And in that very simple way, we are literally changing, literally and figuratively changing our perspective about a situation that was previously stressful, but adding just enough playfulness to it that it's emotionally accessible while still being small enough that we can actually do it. And odds are really good that most children are going to say, I don't know what's just come over you because this is the part where you're usually yelling and it's hard around here, but I'm going to try this more lighthearted approach along with the mundane thing that has to get done anyway. How do those land with you?
Yeah, it's yeah, that pattern breaker is what I hear. It's like all of a sudden we're in this routine, and this is a process we go through. And how do we turn these things into a ritual? Like, rituals are full of deeper meaning. They're activating a lot of our senses, and that's why I love the music to start. It activates. It's emotive, and I encourage the listeners to reflect on your routines of the day as a parent, as an educator, and say, how do I turn this into a ritual which is full of that deeper meaning? And it's about the coming back again to earlier in the conversation. It becomes about the process, not the outcome.
Yes.
And I'd also like to mention for the listeners just to reflect on, when are those times a day where you feel like you have margin as well. Don't set yourself up for failure by saying, okay, after school, when we've got half an hour, we're going to do this thing. Like, you're almost done your day, checklist, your child has been engaged and quite depleted for the day. Don't set yourself up for failure. Be considerate of, like, all right, is there margin? And the best way to get margin is to make sure you're doing those things that are fulfilling to yourself first. Creating that space in the cup, if you will, so you're not overflowing.
Yes, yes. And it really is a matter of making it a habit, but also playing with it, not doing it so rigidly and as routine that it becomes no longer joyful. You know,
Yeah.
you do have to change it up. It's the perfect balance of ritual with elements of novelty. So that it still
That's good.
feels enjoyable. It's predictable. That's where the ritual part comes in. It's predictable.
Yeah.
I do it every day, for example, we're going to find some new way to get to the car. But guess what? None of them means we walk normally. Some days we're going to skip,
Yeah.
some day we're going to hop like a rabbit, whatever it might be. But we find ways to make it consistent while still
Yeah.
being novel enough that it's
Yeah.
interesting.
That's a really good
Yeah.
point, because if you like focus on the ritual, if that's just implemented as a part of routine, it's now routine without that novelty. I like that. You mentioned about that communication with the child, and I'm a parent, and this is where the generational application comes in. So many of us heard our parents say, because I'm the parent and you're the child.
And I said so
And I said so.
because I said so.
The way we represent relationship in words is so important. And, looking at your books, the gentle parenting, gentle discipline as well. Maybe you could give us a big overview of how you got into that gentle discipline specifically.
Yeah, well, I knew a couple of things. I knew the kind of relationship I wanted my relationship with my child to feel like. I didn't necessarily have all of the details of the practical day-to-day stuff, but I knew that at the end of every day, I wanted to be the kind of parent that my child, when she faces a problem in life, that she will decide that she wants to run to me with the problem rather than run from me to keep it from me. And that was really the emotional tone I wanted. I wanted it to be one based on mutual respect and trust and emotional safety, as we keep talking about here today. And then I started unpacking, what does that look like? How do we create this kind of relationship? Well, to your point, it certainly does not come from a parent who says, do it my way because I said so, I'm the adult. That's going to be a child who says, I'm afraid of getting in trouble, therefore I don't feel comfortable going to my parent or caregiver when something hard happens. So really for me, I got my certifications in conscious parenting, did the child development study, worked in a lot of classrooms, really just studied all of the best practices about what helps children feel not that we are their peer necessarily, because they do need adults to guide them and to be role models for them, but we have to be emotionally accessible to them. And that will come in the form of things like validating their feelings. To your point, Lucas, it's not just dust it off, you're fine, don't worry about it. It's, hey, it makes sense to me that you feel upset about that, or whatever it is. We just show up with them, alongside them, with the same amount of respect as we would give anybody else on the planet. And from there, we come back to this place of, whether you call it conscious parenting, gentle parenting, peaceful parenting, whatever, I worry less about the nomenclature and more about, at the end of the day, do you feel like you and your child not only love each other, but just plain like each other?
Yeah.
Because when we like each other, we raise kids who will someday want to come back and visit for the holidays or whatever, and not think, oh no, it's an obligation, whatever. It's a lifelong investment in the kind of relationship we want to have starting today.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And with the book, I know that it's available obviously like on Amazon, and there's an audio book available as well.
Indeed,
Where
there is.
else can, beg your pardon?
I said, indeed, there is.
Yes. Where else can our listeners find some more of your resources?
Thank you for asking. So my website is dandelionseeds.com. There is a hyphen in there. It's dandelion-seeds.com. I've got expert interviews, blog posts, mini courses, things like that. I'm on all the social media out there as far as I know, although of course new ones are popping up all the time. But I'm Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting, with the exception of Instagram, where I'm Dandelion Seeds Positive Living, because the word parenting wouldn't fit.
There you go.
And you'll find all of those links in the show notes also.
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely. I just really want to honour this conversation, because there was a point that really hit home for me personally around, in the modern age, we put play last. And being a founder of the business, involved with play and playful conversations and projects all the time, it's just been a really timely reminder for me personally around, play doesn't have to be the last, and they don't do everything else, tick everything off the list, and then I have margin to do the things I enjoy. And when we're talking about in an era where we're having some really big challenges in the community around well-being, self-care, and I just feel that that's a really poignant reminder for so many listeners to be like, what are you doing first for yourself? How are you nurturing yourself? Not so much just going to get a massage, but how are you being playful first?
What
and
brings you joy?
What brings you joy? And the list is still going to be there. So Vanessa's nodding, saying, yeah, it's a good reminder.
I love your definition of play. I think that that's a really great way of framing it around what brings us joy, because I think the struggle for a lot of adults is, well, play was something that I did when I was younger. That's something that I did when I was a child, but we struggle to define what play actually means for us as adults, with responsibilities, with obligations, with other people to look after. So I think that that is a really, really great definition of play.
And final question before we wrap up. What are your words of encouragement to those listeners that are within this chat? Be like, oh, okay, where do they start? What's your words of encouragement to them to stay playful?
Thank you for asking. I would say most of all, be so gentle with yourself. Everything you feel, every struggle you have, every belief you have, every challenge you have makes sense, because most of what we learn about ourselves and our beliefs about ourselves, we learn between the ages of 2 and 7 or 2 and 9, depending on the research. And we have this incredible opportunity to reparent ourselves along the way of parenting our children rather. And when we are able to show up with compassion, with love, with grace, with curiosity, and with play, capital P on the play, because it's so important for all of us, part of our inner child gets to heal from whatever conflicting messages they might have received in our own childhood. So there's always hope, there's always room to grow, and I'm right there doing the work with you. Just know that you are very much not alone. Be so gentle with yourself while you're learning, because your inner child is right there with you, cheering you on.
Thank you so much, Sarah Armour, for joining us today. We honour you, and thank you for the reminders to stay playful.
Thank you so much.
Sarah.